third Mishnah in the first chapter, and I'll read it and translate it. It's not long, so if you don't have a book, you can study Mishnah the way they used to study Mishnah before it got written down. So Antigonus, the man of Socho, Kibel Shimon the Tzaddik. He received from Shimon the Tzaddik. So if you remember chronologically, we began in-depth discussion of the tradition of handing down the oral tradition with the period of the Second Temple, and the last of the members of the Great Assembly who established Rabbinic Judaism as we know it today. So you're talking about the year, I would say Shimon the Tzaddik is about 300 BCE, 280 maybe. So Antigonus of Socho is a little bit later, so he's probably around 250 before the Common Era, 90 years before the Hanukkah events. So Antigonus of Socho, Kibel Shimon the Tzaddik. So he received his tradition from Shimon the Tzaddik. And the idea is that there's an unbroken chain of tradition. And he said a lot of things, but the things we remember in his name, because remember, until Hillel and Shammai, we remember very little in people's names. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, because I want to study first the Mishnah and study what it says, and then each week I will add bits of history or jurisprudence and so on, so you can understand what's going on historically here. So let's first do his Mishnah, and then we'll talk a little bit about the reason why so few things are mentioned in people's names. Indeed, Pirke Avot represents sometimes the only things we know in the name of these very important figures in the transmission of the rabbinic tradition. So, Antigonus of Socho said as follows: Hu haya omer, he used to say, Al tiyu kavodim amashamshinas arav amanos l'kabel pras. Do not be like servants who serve their master to receive a portion, either a reward or a portion of food. Elahevu kavodim, be like servants amashamshinas arav who serve their master, shelo almanos l'kabel pras, not for the sake of receiving a reward. V'yihi mora shemayim aleichem, let the fear of heaven be upon you. Now, Maimonides understands this to mean that one should serve God out of love, not merely out of a desire for reward or fear of punishment. And therefore he says, let the fear of heaven be upon you. Because if you serve God out of love, love brings you to do what God wants. But it doesn't necessarily bring you to not to do what God doesn't want you to do. There are people who are very enthusiastic about doing things that bring them closer to God, but aren't so careful about not doing things that separate them from God. Because the person who loves and has a passion and who's excited about Judaism can also, that's not a contradiction to being excited about other things too. So therefore we say that even if you're serving God not for the sake of receiving a reward, so you love God exceedingly, it's also a good idea not to forget to have the fear of God upon you. In other words, that you be deathly afraid, as if it were, you be horrified at the prospect of separating yourself from God by doing something wrong. On another level, Antigonus is warning that not everyone will be able to reach the level of serving God and doing what's right solely because it's right. So he says, look, if you can't handle that, at least let the fear of heaven be upon you. That there is accountability, there is reward and punishment in this world and primarily in the next. So if you can't reach the level of seeking the truth because it's true, at least do the right thing, indeed, because there is a reward and a punishment. Now, historically, Antigonus of Socho is close to the time of, the 100 years before Hanukkah, the time already of the Alexander of Macedon conquered Israel, and it came into the Hellenic orbit, first under the Ptolemies of Egypt and then later under the Seleucids, which led to the Hanukkah story. And as you see, Antigonus is a Greek name. So this is already during the period of Greek hegemony. And there was a lot of intellectual and religious ferment. There were two students of Antigonus named Tzadok and Baisus. Tzadok and Baisus heard him say, don't serve the master for the sake of the reward. They came to the conclusion that there is no reward. In other words, they misunderstood the idea, or deliberately did so, and thereby they created what became known as the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, who rejected all rabbinic tradition and not just rabbinic tradition, but the entire oral tradition, insisted on the right to interpret the Torah as they saw fit. And they, among other things, they argued that since the Torah does not explicitly talk about life after death, that therefore it doesn't exist, since it doesn't mention it explicitly, but rather implicitly and in the prophets. So, but the main thing they did is that, and some argue that that actually did believe in the eternity of the soul, but hearing that there's that one should serve God not for the sake of reward, they came to the conclusion that Judaism taught there was no reward or punishment, and they found that unpalatable, so they threw out the baby with the bathwater. They threw out the entire rabbinic tradition. But at any rate, the scripture-only tradition, which had such an influence on early Christianity, which became Christianity as we know it, as well as another various splinter groups during the Second Temple period, begins at this point. And this is why, by the way, they've been extremely careful. The next generation, you'll see, is very careful about spending time with the righteous, as you'll see, with the wise people, because listening a little bit and then wandering off is a very dangerous thing. In other words, they were clearly people who weren't close students, but rather distant students, and or perhaps people had just heard about this. So you'll see there's concern about really spending time, and this ultimately leads to the writing down of the Mishnah, as more and more splinter groups and more cults, as if it were, begin emerging during the Second Temple period, like the people who stashed the Dead Sea Scrolls. Clearly Qumran was, there were no women there, was, definitely out there, as they say, whether they were Josephus's Essenes or not. So this is a time of great ferment, and the students or the people who had heard this idea of Antigonus and not properly understood it went off and formed their own set of religious beliefs that ultimately gave rise to a lot of problems. So now, as far as the idea itself, the idea itself is valid. That even though reward is in the nature of things, if one serves Hashem, if one does what God desires, one becomes connected to God as the source of life, and therefore, in particular in the next world, one enjoys the pleasure of that closeness to God. But that reward is secondary to the idea that we do what we're here because God asked us to do it. And this idea of complete commitment for the sake of the commitment, essentially following the truth of our creation because it's true. And again, that's the Rambam's language. Serving God out of love is, Maimonides says, accepting, loving the truth because it's the truth, which is a very interesting concept. In other words, that means to say, in a sense, that if you do things because God has given you something, that's why the word for reward is pras, a piece. Pras is a piece of something. You're not getting the whole picture. There's you and there's God, and God gives you something because you do what God wants. But when you accept the truth because it's the truth, so then you are emulating God. Then you are living exactly with God's agenda. You're completely one with God because what you're doing is precisely what God imagined. You're not doing it because God is giving you something. You're doing it because God imagined, that Sergei's going to put on tefillin, and so on and so forth. And when we do what God imagined us doing, as if it were solely because God imagined it, so then we are truly identified with God. There's no barrier of us seeing ourselves as another who needs a reward. The closeness to God is its own reward. And that unity means that we attain a complete identification, as if it were a complete merging and melding with God's will and wisdom, which in a way is not a reward, but it's the greatest reward that that as if it were that God chose to need us, and now that we're exactly what God chose to need, so we complete as if it were God's purpose and agenda. But at the highest level, this is only possible if we love the truth for its own sake. And the other advantage of this approach, obviously, is that since the reward and punishment are usually not visible in this world, a person who's very reward-oriented will always be worried about, what really will happen after death. Or why don't I have a better life in this world, considering all the good things I've done? A person who doesn't care about any of that stuff, he just loves the truth because it's the truth. And the only reason he seeks any benefit or reward, or she seeks any benefit or reward, is solely that you have the wherewithal to serve Hashem, the health, the wealth, and so on, to serve God. So such a person isn't bothered by anything. This is the concept of hishtavos, of equanimity, in the Musar and the moral literature, which means, good, bad, tough, easy. It doesn't make a difference because you have the greatest reward, which is no one can ever stop a Jew from attaining the truth. No one can ever stop us from living the truth, because since some mitzvot are in the brain, even if someone puts you in shackles of iron, you're still free to do whatever mitzvot exist in the brain. And therefore, the person who seeks the truth because it's true, because that's always available, is never unhappy, is free from all limitations, and is the freest and happiest person that can be. But that's not a reward, that's a byproduct of abandoning everything but the truth. So what Antigonus is talking about is a very high level, and that's why he warns us, which Tzaddik Ubaisis did in here, let the fear of heaven be upon you. In other words, it's okay to serve God for lesser reasons. But ultimately, the person who seeks the truth because it's true is the person who is truly free and whose life is always good and always happy. As far as seeking the truth, as far as ulterior motives, obviously the Rambam says that we begin by giving children sweets, and then when they study Torah, then we give them, when they get older, money and so on, until they learn to seek the truth because it's the truth. So there's a famous story about this that takes place with the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. The third Lubavitcher Rebbe was Rebbe in the time after, basically before the pogroms of the 1880s, before the mass immigration, but after the really aggressive enforcement of the Pale of Settlement and the Cantonist decree of drafting Jewish children under Tsar Nikolai. So the Tzemach Tzedek, who was Rebbe from 1828 to Lubavitch Rebbe from 1828 to 1866, had a relatively stable time when the community grew, when Jews by and large remained in Russia. So something like 500,000 of the Jews in the Russian Empire, perhaps 600,000, saw themselves as his Hasidim. So he had a tremendous following. Obviously, some of it was just, identification, the way someone might use a certain siddur. But he had a lot of Hasidim, and the story goes that there was one relatively large town in Belarus, that one of his Hasidim was the Mashpia, he was the spiritual guide to that town. So one day, the Tzemach Tzedek, he used to come with a small contingent of people to spend the Elul and Tishrei, to spend the months of the high holidays with the Tzemach Tzedek. So Tzemach Tzedek says, so what do you do all winter? He says, well, as you know, this is true of the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, but all the Rebbeim said a lot of their teaching, a bulk of their teaching, the discourses and so on were given over during the month of Tishrei, because every day that's a holiday, they said it every day, every Shabbos, they spoke extensively, and there's other days that are important days in that month, in the month of Tishrei. So probably 40% of it, the Rebbe was different, but until this last Rebbe, but probably 40% of what they said and taught was during the month of Tishrei. So if someone went for Tishrei and he memorized everything and made notes, he had literally hundreds of pages to teach the rest of the year. So Tzemach Tzedek asked this chassid, so what do you do when you go home to your town? So he says, well, every Mitzvah Shabbos we get together, and I teach Chassidus. I teach them. I give over in a way they can understand. It was farming and peasant community. It was relatively simple. It was actually he used to go to the colonies in Kherson, where, as you know, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe in Crimea, the Mittler Rebbe, Dov Ber, and the Rebbeim strengthened it. Even the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, during the communist era, got an exemption from the Soviet government to take money from the Joint Distribution Committee to support the agricultural colonies in Kherson. Since they were already collective farms, that's the way the Mittler Rebbe set them up. But like Moshavot, where each person had their portion, so the communists actually, for some reason, didn't bother them too much. They were fertile, they were more or less collective, they decided they weren't bourgeois, and they left them alone. So, and they were happy to have the money coming from America. The later Stalin tended to round up everyone, what to do with that, but that's another story. But be that as it may, so you had these large, not business, not peddlers, not craftsmen, but very large agricultural communities. So these are people who, in the winter, they had time. So every Mitzvah Shabbos, every Saturday night, he would get together, and he says, and I'd give over in a way people could understand. I'd give over what I learned from the Tzemach Tzedek. But he says, but in order to get people in the right mood, we provide them with punch. And punch back then was a big pot of water boiled with a few pounds of sugar thrown in, and then a few gallons of pure alcohol. So you drink it in the course of the night, you get a nice buzz. So the Tzemach Tzedek looked at him and says, punch? You're combining Chassidus with punch? People are drinking and they're learning Chassidus. He says, no more punch, just teach them the Chassidus. So a year later, the Tzemach Tzedek comes back to the Tzemach Tzedek, and he goes to see the Tzemach Tzedek before he leaves. He says, well, how are things going? He says, well, I took your idea of no punch, and what happened was, is that slowly but surely the attendance dwindled. We used to get 300 people, and by the end of the winter, when planting season came in, we were only getting 50 or 60 people. So the Tzemach Tzedek said, you know what? Let them drink their punch as long as they'll study Chassidus. So the point, of course, is that one should come out on a cold Saturday night and a cold Mitzvah Shabbat solely for one reason: to study Torah and to hear the secrets of the Torah. But if it takes some hot punch, if your animal soul is involved too, if the reward is involved too, and that's part of the issue. Where one serves God because of the reward, the body and the animal soul are also involved. They also want the reward. So, but he said, you know what? If they're going to come and hear Chassidus, let them have their punch. So this is Antigonus' point that let the fear of heaven be on you. If it takes reward, it takes punishment, whatever it takes. The main thing is to do what's right. Yeah, we want the truth because the truth. That's an ideal. But we shouldn't let the ideal get in the way of actual involvement, because we rather would have less idealistic, less perfect people who do what's right, because ultimately Judaism is about participation at whatever level. So that's what Antigonus is really teaching us. But Tzadok Ubaisus missed the last part and came to the conclusion that a system that demands such perfection can't be correct. So they threw out, with a little bit of bathwater, they threw out many babies, and that's how the Sadducees began. And the Sadducees, of course, led to the early Christians, they led to the Christs, they led to a lot of problems. Indeed, the lack of the sense that the rabbis had no authority they engendered had another tragic result, is that, as you know, during the run-up to the Great Revolt that led to the destruction of the Temple, the Great Revolt began in 66 of the Common Era, the Brionim, the Zealots, who insisted on fighting with the Romans and also killing each other, the rabbis, the Chachamim, were very against them. But the Chachamim, they didn't pay any attention to the Chachamim because the Sadducees, who had infiltrated the temple, and most importantly, the Hasmonean kings, the later Hasmonean kings, had been advocates of the Sadducees. They ultimately caused a erosion in the respect. So when the rabbinical authorities, when the Sanhedrin, as if it were, declared that this revolt against the Romans isn't going to work, and what the Romans want is power, and everyone should just calm down and accept the indignities and they'll leave them alone, and they refused to, that led to the destruction of the temple and the terrible things that followed. And this all goes back to the erosion in their authority that begins at this time period. So behind this statement there lies a serious schism within the Jewish people. And this brings us to the next Mishnah, which is the fourth Mishnah. Yosi ben Yoezer, I'll read it and translate it to those who don't have books, and next week we'll have handouts. Yosi, the son of Yoezer from Tzeredah, and Yosi, the son of Yochanan from Jerusalem, Kiblu Mehem, received from them. Yosi ben Yoezer said, "Let your house be a house of gathering for the sages. Roll in the dust of their feet, and drink with thirst their words." Now, his main point was you have to hang around the sages. Don't hear things secondhand. And this is before writing. Don't hear things secondhand. Don't hear something you like and then build your own edifice out of it. In other words, listen what they're saying. Once you become a sage, you can have your opinion too. But listen. In other words, let your house be a place where the sages gather. Invite them in. Let your home be a place where people study and you participate. Sit in the dust of their feet. It means to say, listen carefully. Dust is low. Be humble. Before you run off with your opinions and your theories and so on, learn. Listen. Absorb what's said before. Then add something. And drink with thirst their words. In other words, there's two ways of learning. One way of learning is you're listening to what validates your opinion. The other way of learning is you genuinely desire knowledge. Drink with thirst. In other words, don't wait to hear that line that supports your preconceived notions. As you know, anyone can use any text to support what they believe. As the story goes, there once was a son who had a father who unfortunately was a terrible drunk. So finally, one day he realizes that he can get his father out of his alcoholism. There's an even worse alcoholic lying on the street, rolling in the mud, covered with filth. The kids are throwing things that are making fun of him, and he's lying there mumbling to himself. So he takes his father out of the house and he shows his father, "This is what you're going to become. Stop drinking." He has the perfect text. So the father runs over to the drunk. So the son runs after him, wants to hear what he's saying. And he hears the father whispering to the drunk, "Tell me, my good man, where did you get such good wine?" And the point is, if you're looking for something that validates your worldview, you'll find it. Drink with thirst. Be a receptacle. Want the knowledge because you accept that the knowledge is valuable. And this is a response to what happened in the previous generation, where people had their notions and used what was said to support it. And the beginning of any new knowledge is a thorough command of what came before and a respect for it. That's first of all. The second important idea over here, to me, the idea of the dust to their feet is an interesting thing. What kind of sage should you learn from? Someone who has dust on his feet. What does that mean? So we know why does Abraham asks the wayfarers to wash their feet? Because their feet were dusty from the journey. The Gemara says that let us remember the men of the early Sanhedrins of this time period for the good, because it says they would gird their loins with iron chains. It means they put on a big heavy belt so as to bear the rigors of the journey and the loads they have to carry. and they would walk through all of Israel, through all the villages and all the farms and so on, to see what needed fixing, to identify those promising children who could be brought to Jerusalem to become the next generation of sages, and to hear the needs and the plaints of the people. So what kind of sage do we drink their words in thirst? Who should we learn from? The person who has dust on their feet. Not the theoretical scholar who spent, his whole life in a corner, but the one who understands the pain of the people, the one who goes out, the one who understands, when they're dealing with the halacha, they understand what real life is, what the people are like, what the technology is, what people are going through, and so on and so forth. You have to have dust on your feet. So such a person, having this abik b'afar agleim, roll in the dust of their feet in their experience, learn from people who have been forced to confront the real world and deal and express their Torah in the real world. Not those people who have no connection. There's a very famous story in the Babylonian Talmud in Brachot, where Rabbi Gamliel was deposed for being disrespectful to his students. And one of the things that happened is he finally went to the person who he was thrown out because he threw him out. Rabbi Gamliel was thrown out because he insulted Rabbi Yeshua. So he went to Rabbi Yeshua's house. Rabbi Gamliel was the leader of the Sanhedrin, a descendant of Hillel, an aristocrat, the people the Romans came to when they wanted to talk to the Jewish people, a very wealthy person, a person of distinguished lineage. So he came to the house of Rabbi Yeshua to ask his forgiveness. And so Rabbi Yeshua forgives him. And he says, tell me, why do you have the walls of your house painted black? He says, they're not painted black. To make a living, I'm a blacksmith. This is from the charcoal, the soot, from the forge that comes into the house. And he says, woe is to the generation whose leaders don't know what the ordinary people go through. And that's exactly the point. In the dust of their feet, in other words, you get dust because you bring it in from outside. Because in the house, we know from the Gemara, they used to sprinkle the floor with water to keep that earth floors. They sprinkle the floor with water to keep the dust out. The dust comes from outside. The person who knows the real world, who goes out, who knows the people, who cares about the people, that's the one you should learn from. And this is very, very early, and it's very, very ingrained in Jewish tradition. It's interesting to note that in the Talmud, it's not the thing that we tend to rely on when we want to establish a law is not so much the statements that people said, but we call ma'aseh rav. They're the deeds of the teacher, how they actually live. If they followed a certain law in real life, we know that it's for real. Where they ruled for other people in that way, we know it's for real. If we want to understand the character trait, people's pronouncements are less important than how they behave. The entire section of the Talmud, which is enshrined in Jewish law, as to conflict of interest. Jewish law has a very strict rule about conflict of interest in judges, that the slightest favoritism should cause you to recuse yourself, to remove yourself from a legal case. We don't know this from a set of laws, we know this from a set of stories, where people inconvenienced themselves to step down from a case because they felt that they were somehow biased, for very tiny and subtle reasons. The real life experience is the deepest and largest source of Jewish tradition. And the people who actually, in other words, if you look at the descriptions of the great rabbis who really became the people who we see as the ultimate authorities, every one of them were people who were deeply engaged in people's lives. Maimonides was a doctor, and before that, had wandered all over as a refugee. And the Ramah was a merchant who was deeply involved in charitable affairs with Moshe Isserles. And about the Baal Shem Tov had spent 20 years wandering as an itinerant beggar, disguised as such. I mean, he was a very poor person, but he had spent his time wandering among the the most disadvantaged of the population before he ever became a leader, and so on and so forth. Hillel had been a woodchopper before he became Hillel, etc. So this is now, to be honest, I've not seen this anywhere, but based on the Gemara about Abraham, based on the Gemara about how they used to wander about, and based on this story, you'll excuse me for bringing in my own interpretations, and there are so many other good ones, but I think this is the meaning of to roll in the dust of your feet. Okay, so anyone have any questions on Mishnahs 3 and 4? Spoken for long enough.
Can I ask a question? It looks like that the way the Mishnah 3 formulated, it brings a lot of problems, just from the way it is. Well, how could it be? Yeah.
Well, what they said was true. The point is the danger. The point lies in the danger of the truth being misunderstood. That's why Mishnah 4 comes in. Antigonus of Socho was quite clear as to what he believed and so on. Clearly, there was a problem. The problem had to do, to a certain degree, with a degree of malice on part of tzaddik ubaisos, of people who wanted to validate their words rather than drink them in with thirst and so on. But this is what happens. There's always, if you look at Jewish history, sometimes things have to be, you have to deal with things because there's a problem. Problems emerge. Jewish history is a long series of problems, and you have to deal with them. There was a destruction of the temple. There was the Roman exile. So then we needed to write the Mishnah down, which brings its own problems in trade. We rely on the Talmud. The Talmud becomes incomprehensible, so you need a Rashi and a Rambam. Lending money becomes a fundamental part of business. Jews don't own land anymore, so we have to find a way for people to lend money and make a profit out of it without invalidating the obligation to lend money to your fellow Jew when they're in need. So problems emerge. And it's the job of the sages to understand the people, understand the problem, and solve it.
No, it's just amazing that right in the beginning of a book which seemed to be very clear, it's named Pirke Avot, so just everybody at least could grasp simple meaning from it, and add more positive meanings, but the major consequence is such a negative understanding.
Well, it wasn't the only consequence. I mean, clearly throughout Jewish history, Jews have aspired to the truth because of the sake of the truth. I'm just, but there's a historical reason as to what the next generation has to say. Yosi ben Yochanan, is responding to the problems with tzadok and vices. But look, that's always possible. They say, how did the Jews know to make the golden calf? Because they saw the angel who's in the form of the ox. The vision of Yecheskel. There's an angel in the form of an ox. Anything can be misused. That's the reality. And that's exactly the point, that with a bit of humility and a genuine desire to learn rather than a desire to prove your point, we can go a long way.
I read an interpretation somewhere that when Herod finished the temple, what year was it?
Herod is it's before most of the Mishnah is written, but it's later than these particular episodes.
Around 20, 30 something.
Well, so Herod redid the temple probably the year 20, 40 years, 50 years before it was destroyed.
So he brought in thousands of young Jewish men, very strong men. They, like 15.
Yeah.
15 years later, there was 30.
Yeah.
Like 30,000, 40,000, and they had absolutely no work after the temple was finished. They found no work for them. And this young man, I read it some Jewish men, and so there were thousands of them with nothing to do, and they were all very able. incapable, and they decided that they can take the power. And so they killed the rabbis right in the temple. And from that, the whole thing started.
Well, they didn't actually kill the rabbis.
Well,
They
they
tended to kill each other.
But from that I've read that they actually entered the temple and killed everybody there, and that's how they began the whole thing.
Well, they came into the temple and killed the people they didn't agree with, the skiarim, the people with the short swords.
But it's true, right? But,
Well, it's in
speaking of
Josephus.
truth, I don't know.
Well, it's in Josephus, which means that it could be true.
Oh, so you could have just followed the
Josephus, it's not just Josephus. Herodotus does the same thing. Who was the?
So it's not
Columbus's name, Pliny. All the ancient writers are writing both history and fiction. In other words, someone once said, who pioneered the novelization of faction, Truman Capote. Says Truman Capote was just returning to the literary forms of the classical world, of the ancient world, in a sense. So what I'm saying is that Josephus said a lot of things because the Romans who paid his salary wanted to hear them.
You didn't hear it in that's what I'm saying. You didn't hear it in any other source.
No,
right?
but no, there's definitely reference to the Skiari in the Talmud. Josephus is definitely telling us the truth that this happened. Whether it happened the same, whether it was as extreme or even worse, what I'm saying is anything we only have Josephus for. That we had Biryonim who didn't allow the Jews to surrender, that's in the Talmud. And the Talmud, of course, is quoting the traditions from 200 years before. So, and not Josephus. So that particular episode, I don't doubt that it was true. I'm just not sure that it happened exactly as he described.
In terms of seeking the truth and God, all us feeling the will of God and considering the current events of this young man who certainly think they fulfill the will of God.
Where?
Well, all this bombers and stuff like this.
Yeah, I mean, that's why Judaism. There are two components to the way Judaism sees itself. One is the belief in God. The other is the demand for a direct provenance. That Sinai be an actual historical event, and that everything be validated by logical argumentation and so on. As you know, the main point of Judaism isn't that Moses was a great prophet. The main point of Judaism isn't that God created the world. The main point of Judaism, both Maimonides and the Kuzari say this, and all the great Jewish philosophers say this, is that there was a collective experience of the Jewish people beginning to receive the law directly from God at Sinai. The point, and everything that's said in the name of God has to be validated, it has to be interpreted, there has to be a consensus. There's actually this one of the talks that I've done in the past has been, could Judaism be hijacked by fanatics? And I think we'll always have fanatics, but they'll never become the mainstream. And the reason is because Judaism tends towards consensus and balance and so on. Even if every generation, including this one, you have a goodly number of what we call in Yiddish Meshugoyim floating around. And the core point is that no one gets to say, I think this is what the Bible says, or I think this is what the Quran says, and so on. In Judaism, it doesn't happen. No one gets to say themselves, I think I ought to do this because. So, for example, the Torah talks about wipe out the Canaanites, right? So, someone who's going off on their own, and you hear this often, from people who are very proud, pro-Israel, right-wing Jews, but who don't know any Torah. Oh, we should kill all the Arabs. It's the 7 nations, and the 7 nations don't exist anymore, and it's only at a certain point in history. It's the whole annihilative commandment is rabbinically narrow, not rabbinically, but the rabbis in interpretation, they narrow it down, they make it an exception rather than the rule, and so on. What's my point? That in Judaism, you don't get to decide what God wants. You actually have to figure it out, and it's an intellectual process and a process of consensus, etc. So believing that God wants something from you isn't enough. Lots of Jews have had ecstatic visions over the years. But the law is, the Torah says, that an ecstatic vision never beats the code of Jewish law. You can have the most amazing vision, that tells you, I don't know, to put on tefillin on Shabbos. It's a sin to put tefillin on Shabbos. The moment people discovered that Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah, was breaking the laws of the code of Jewish law, that's when he lost his followers. That's when everyone knew he was full of it. Even before he converted to Islam. Because in Judaism, inspiration, experience, visions, more than that, Jewish law says that if someone comes and is a genuine prophet and performs amazing miracles and he says, God told me to break some law, or even God told me that the law should be like Rabbi X and not like Rabbi Y, you know he's a false prophet and you execute him. Because no ecstasy, no prophecy, no vision, no self-actualized enthusiasm stands in the way of the consensus of the rigid, complex, intellectual analysis of the Torah that lies at the core of Judaism. Judaism's nitpicking, Judaism's intellectualism is its salvation. You'll never have such things in Jews who remain loyal to Judaism. The Sadducees did all kinds of terrible things when they were in power, precisely because they abandoned this. So what I'm saying is that the desire of the truth for the sake of the truth in Judaism, what does it say? Serving the master. The details of Jewish law. You can be as ecstatic as you want, but it doesn't mean that you can take your violin and start playing music on Shabbat because it makes you feel good. The rabbis say you can't. The temple, yeah, but not outside the temple. You might feel that these Arabs are just so pesky and they're such a pain in the neck and they caused us so much trouble. I'm inspired to annihilate them like the Canaanites were annihilated. No, they're not Canaanites. You're not allowed to annihilate them. You have to deal with them otherwise. And as a matter of fact, the halacha says that if you have people living in your midst and you're giving out welfare, you're giving out charity, you got to give them too. Famous story with Yoezer of Tzeredah. The Rebbe, as you know, was very supportive of a complete Israel and very against any concessions and very strong about not responding to any act of terror. Nevertheless, someone came and said, the new law, the 50s or 60s, that gives benefit to everyone who has children, they're giving child benefit to Arabs too. So he said he wants to put a law through the Knesset that Arabs shouldn't get these benefits for having children. So the Rebbe told him that it's a mitzvah for every human being to have children. And therefore, if you are responsible for people and you have a means of encouraging them to have children, you have to do for the Arabs exactly what you do for the Jews. Because they're in your government. They're under your control. And the Rebbe went further once. He says that there's two halachas. One is that Esav hates Jacob. That there are many social groupings among the non-Jews who are trained from their mother's milk to hate Jews. On the other hand, it says that when you give out food in times of trouble, when you give out charity, you feed the poor of the non-Jews with the poor of the Jews. So he says this is contradictory. On one hand, so the Rebbe says, no, it's not contradictory. They may intrinsically hate Jews. They may take your charity and still hate you. It makes no difference. It's your obligation to care for other human beings because Hashem told you so. If they hate you and they seek to harm you, then you have to take measures against them. But they're two separate questions. And the point goes back to this idea that Judaism is entirely driven not by emotion, not by superficial allegories to events in the Torah, but by a calm, cool, dispassionate, highly intellectual system. And those are not dirty words in Jewish religion. Intellectual, details, analysis, consensus, proof, compromise, all those words, which are bad words for religious ecstatics throughout history, in all religions, those are holy words by us. And again, let's go back to exactly the Mishnah we were studying, which says what? It says quite explicitly, let the sages gather in your home, pay attention to those who've been out there, and drink with thirst their words. In other words, it's really important to have these discussions and to be part of them. And that's another aspect, that Judaism never allowed the development and study of Judaism to remain the job of an elite. Judaism demands that all of us be involved at some level. And you know what, if you look at the Talmud, every once in a while, some very ordinary person will make a claim in court and will say, you know what, you're right. And that becomes part of the Talmud. That becomes one of the principles of the Talmud. So, so all these ideas are already emerging in the very early Second Temple period. And all the trouble comes when these ideas get lost. Even today. If you look at certain activities that are done in the name of religiosity, and you ask almost every rabbi under the sun, is this halachically permissible? Is this abusive behavior permissible? Is this acceptable? They'll say no. And because Judaism is so centered around consensus and around essentially the rule of the Torah, in the end these groups will die out because they don't have any support. They are a rebellion against standard Judaism, no different than secularism is. The fanatics, in other words, the fanatics among the Haredim in Israel are equally as deviant from Judaism as the secularists who deny. They're both deviant. And the deviation in the direction of some extreme version of observance is as much a rebellion against God as a deviation in the direction of leniency and giving up on observance. And in a way it's worse, because the people who deviate to the left, they, for reasons mostly historical, don't accept the Torah. These are people who claim to accept the Torah. So their sin is far greater. But at any rate, Judaism has a way of organizing, of self-rectifying in these matters. Yeah.
So the authorities in Emmanuel in Israel during the controversy with the Sephardic child in the Torah Karta, with that...
You mean the Beit Shemesh, no?
The Beit Shemesh.
The Beit Shemesh with the school? Yeah, it's, obviously. And none of that has any basis in Torah.
So, is there a method of dealing with that?
The method of dealing with it is since you don't have a full separation of church and state in Israel, is for the rabbinical community to demand that the state put a stop to this bad behavior and to force the school to accept the child and so on.
What is the story?
The story is that there was a school in Beit Shemesh, a very good girls' high school, that wouldn't accept children from Sephardic homes because it felt that they weren't that those homes were not as perfectly religious as the Ashkenazi homes. Mostly it's because they were different, because they had different customs and so on and so forth. Someone who doesn't keep your customs doesn't mean they're less religious. It means they're religious in a different way. But the story's been going on for years. It's a long story. Basically, the problem in Israel is that there are so many Jews and so many religious Jews that everyone gets to live in their own little world. I remember in Los Angeles in 1980, there was a small handful of Orthodox Jews. So we all had the same kashrus, we all had the same schools, and that's everyone. From people who would belong to Lincoln Square Synagogue to people who belong to Satmar. We all went to the same schools and ate the same. Then as the community exploded and grew 100 times, now there's lots of schools and lots of acherim and so on. There's a certain luxury in large numbers that is actually bad. Not the numbers, chas v'shalom, but there's, God forbid, but there's a problem when people get to only hang around with people exactly like them. And they never meet a Jew who does anything different. And then they begin to confuse what they do in their community with Torah, which is a huge mistake. But that's what's going on. But again, if we take what the Pirke Avot is saying, that, you should have a gathering of sages, not just your rabbi. It's very interesting. Ever we're talking about this, I remember actually a commentary, which I forget which, because it's not in here, it's not on my phone, but where it says that what is it to be a gathering of sages? Because everyone had their teacher. It's important to have a teacher and to follow him, but have a gathering. Don't just invite one rabbi. Invite a bunch of them. Like Yuri's piano shop. Okay, let's do one more Mishnah before we go. Okay, let's go back. So we'll do one more Mishnah for tonight. Okay, this Mishnah is a Mishnah that is a very controversial Mishnah. It's the famous "Don't talk too much to women" Mishnah. So let's read it. I always said that it would have been better if they put this in like chapter 6. So by the time we get to chapter 6, people already know that Pirke Avot is a valuable statement. However, I don't think apologetics are necessary. I think a simple reading of the Mishnah is sufficient. This is Rabbi Shimon from Hirsch's reading, by the way. Yosi ben Yochanan in Shushalayim Omer. Yosi ben Yochanan said, "You beischa pesuach l'revacha. Let your house be open to wide. In other words, let everyone, have lots of guests, have lots of people. Again, hear lots of ideas. V'yoaniyim b'nei beisecha." So this is the next generation. Because remember, now we're in the peers. So this is Yosi ben Yoezer's friend. Next week, I'll talk about the peers and their function, because Hillel and Shammai are the last of them. And let the poor be regulars in your home. In other words, don't merely write checks to the poor. The fact they're poor doesn't make them any less Jews. So let them be in your social circle. Make sure that they're part of your household, that they're at home, that they feel free to speak, and so on and so forth. In other words, don't allow social class to create barriers between Jews. V'altar b'sicha im ha'isha, and do not be overly abundant in light conversation with the woman. Sicha means light conversation. Okay, so that's an interesting story. Originally, there were two kinds. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe's very deep discussions are called sichot. It's really very simple. A long time ago, originally, the very deep discourses the Lubavitcher Rebbe said we'll call Maimarim. So the things that he spoke that weren't these very formal deep discourses were called sichot, to indicate that they were, compared to the Maimarim, lighter. But the Rebbe just tended to speak a lot longer and a lot deeper, but they still got called sichot. Even though by the Rebbe the Maimarim were much shorter, and it's the sichot that carry most of his content. But, tradition is tradition. But the whole point of calling in Chabad, calling sichot, was to indicate that they were lighter fare compared to the Maimarim. But you understand that what's lighter fare by the Lubavitcher Rebbeim would be enough to give Kant a headache. But at any rate, but Sicha means light conversation. And Shimshon Hirsch, I believe it's him or his son-in-law, Rabbi Breuer, say, Ha'isha should say im isha with a woman. Ha'isha is the woman. In other words, the woman objectified. In other words, don't engage in frivolous conversation with a woman because she's a woman. In other words, because you're flirting with her. And this is true with ishte omru, even with your own wife. In other words, one should not engage in light and frivolous conversation even with your own wife, because that's really not where the relationship should be. And it leads to inappropriate conversations with other women, all the more so with your friend's wife. Mikan amru chachamim, from here the sages say, Kol zman she'adam mar b'sicha im ha'isha. Any time that a person engages in frivolous conversation with the woman, gorem ra la'atzmei, causes evil to himself. Ubotil medivrei Torah, and he wastes time from the study of Torah. In the end, he inherits Gehenna. Because, of course, the Mishnah feel very much in life after death, and Gehenna is the negative place that souls pass through to expiate their sins. But the point is quite clear. Why is it written in the male? Because that's the nature of society, and as is well known, as the Gemara says, it is the way of men to pursue women. And even though the world has changed a great deal, that's still the case more so. But at any rate, I don't think it believes any deep apologetics and so on. It's quite clear that we're talking about the kind of behavior that leads to frivolity and sin. And obviously, we want men and women to be able to interact intelligently. At the same time, there's always a danger of immorality. There's always problems throughout human history. Helen of Troy, etc., Avshalom and his sister. There's always problems about, so the question is, how do men and women, so you can do what they do in Afghanistan and lock them all up and put garbage bags on their heads. And this is an important point that my mother made, so it's made by a genuine female scholar. But rather than place the onus on the women, modesty is an issue, but, not garbage bag quality. That basically place the onus on the men. We don't say to the women, don't be temptations. We don't say to the women, don't be flirts. We don't say to the women, lock yourself away or don't drive a car because that could be bad. We tell the men, behave yourselves. Because it's generally the men who are the aggressors. So, though the statement, do not talk overly to a woman, seems, is jarring when you read it, if you understand that it's not dibor, but sicha, it's not any kind of speech, but sicha, that we're talking about the woman, not a woman. In other words, the woman objectified as a object of sexual attraction, I don't think it's really a terribly difficult thing to understand. And we all know that though it takes two to tango, and obviously there have been as many licentious women as licentious men. I mean, statistically speaking, it just has to be the case. The fact is again that men tend to be the ones not just who are more aggressive. They tend to be the ones that are driven by externalities much more so than women. And there's ample studies for this, and I don't have to dwell on this more with an educated crowd. But at any rate, that's the simple interpretation of the Mishnah. You can't really accuse it of being modern because it's a 19th century interpretation for the Victorian era. So it's clearly a genuine attempt to understand the Mishnah. So, any comments?
Well, what is 19th century?
Mishnah
was written when?
No, the Mishnah comes from a long time before, but I'm saying Rabbi Shlomo Hirsch makes the point about the linguistic nature of the Mishnah. I mean, conceivably, it's meant to be before too. As a matter of fact,
the Mishnah was like first century.
Yeah, he said a third actually, but this particular is from the 2nd century BCE. This particular statement.
Well, but it was easy for the Jewish community. Jewish women were never part of the prayer, never part of the. I mean, that was how life was, right? Woman was with the kids.
No, but not really. See, that's the thing. Women might have been with the kids, but they remember everything took place in the home. It's very clear from the Talmud that women tend to be very involved in what went on. A lot of the court cases in the Talmud are brought by women. Yeah. Women were engaged in business. Women were
even
in the Talmudic period, more than that. Talmudic period where Jews were autonomous, more so in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, Jews had to conform to Christian norms, whereas in the Talmudic period, where in general the Persians were much more easygoing and the Jews were autonomous, women owned property, women were very active in business, and so on. It's much more than that. Even in the period of the Tanakh, right? Elisha comes by. And it's a Shunem, and there's an Isha Gadol, there's a great woman, a woman of great influence, and she's the one, she has a husband, but she's the one who provides Elisha with the house and chases him when her son dies and so on. There's a lot of these things. There are a lot of, the isolation of women to the, to the house and all that has more to do with the poverty and limited opportunities for the men in the Pale of Settlement. Remember, when we talk about traditional Judaism, because we're all children of immigrants, you guys later, some of us earlier, our vision of traditional Judaism is the Judaism of the Pale of Settlement around 1880. That's our vision. And that was a very distorted Judaism because of all the pressure and the constant erosion of opportunity that Tsarist Russia had imposed on the Jews, which they didn't want in the first place. They got them when they partitioned Poland. So,
they needed peasants.
What?
Catherine the Great invited thousands and thousands of Germany. They needed peasants. There were areas that nobody wanted to settle in and they couldn't produce.
But Catherine didn't invite any Jews.
I think I read.
She did not. Just the opposite. She founded the Pale of Settlement. Katrina did not invite any Jews. As a matter of fact, until relatively late in Russian history, it wasn't just illegal. It was Jews weren't allowed to enter Russia on pain of death. Well, as late as the 17th century. Then, when they conquered part of the Ukraine and so on and so forth, they ended up with a lot of Jews that they didn't want. Poland later, but they already took, part of the Ukraine and so on. And they ended up with a bunch of Jews. But anyway, my point is that the Pale of Settlement was a period of time where Jews had very little opportunities, and everyone was stuck at home, and and all the men were struggling for a few kopecks here and there. That's why the second Lubavitch Rebbe started these agricultural colonies. He saw that the entire society was becoming corrupted by the terrible poverty and competition, and figured if people have an opportunity to actually farm and produce something and have some room, it would be a better thing. But the bottom line is that if you look at the Talmud, or you even look at say the memoirs of Gluckel of Hamel, who was a German Jewess in the 17th century, who had a big business and so on, you'll see that she was a very religious woman. But she clearly was very active in business and in other things, and made important decisions.
I just finished reading it. I have a copy. It's an amazing book.
This is a very empowered woman, and she was literate and wrote a beautiful Yiddish.
What's her name?
Gluckel of Hamel. You haven't heard of her? She's a major feminist figure and was also an entirely religious Jew, but she wasn't feminist because she wasn't uncommon. What is true is that the wealthier or more educated a family was, in other words, the wealthier, more rabbinic a family was, the more learned and the more independent the women were. But again, that's an economic function.
So, speaking of women rabbis, conservative rabbis,
that's another question.
Because I had a conversation, she said, there's nothing in the Torah that women cannot be rabbis. Her father was rabbi, her grandfather was rabbi.
There's nothing that says women can't be scholars. To be a rabbi, to sit on a betin, to officiate at certain activities, to officiate in the synagogue, that clearly halacha proscribes. There's no question halacha proscribes about half the things that a rabbi does. And the other half you don't need a title for. Go to any Chabad house. Go to any Chabad house. The women are equally involved in teaching a song, but no one ever called them rabbi. When we talk about the title rabbi, we're talking about sitting on a beit din. We're talking about refereeing, not really conducting. Anyone can conduct the service.
Sages would be against it.
Not to say that Jewish law is against. Jewish law says that men and women are equal in many things, but in religious life they have different roles. In the synagogue, in that one area, not in business, not necessarily in Torah study, not in importance in the community, but with regards to religious roles, public religious roles. Those were set up for men and not for women. It's quite clear. There's not a great deal of debate about that.
Although she spends a lot of time proving that, show me that's where it specifically says that woman cannot.
Well, it also depends how you define a rabbi. In other words, if you argue, just by way of example, if you were to argue that the idea that a minyan is only men is irrelevant, so then if a minyan is a mixture of men and women, why could a woman be a rabbi? But the fact is that's not the halacha.
Part of the reason why it seems more reasonable for them to imagine that a woman can be a rabbi is they don't actually call upon their rabbis, including the men rabbis, to do the things that you need to have a rabbi to do. I mean, they don't go to a beit din to resolve disputes between one conservative congregant and another. They sue each other in secular law. The only time they use a beit din is for get. So the things that you need, I mean, anybody can teach, anybody can preach.
But
you don't need to be a rabbi to teach or
but historically, rabbis have
or to
taken
do social support kind of functions.
Well, that's my point. Every woman in every Chabad house does
Right,
that.
but the sine qua non of being a rabbi is that you, in a binding way, in a legally binding way, you arbitrate disputes between Jews and you determine for that Jew what is or is not a mitzvah. And as long as the Reform or conservative communities don't look to their rabbis to do that, well, sure, anybody can have that function in their community, and you call them anything you want because they're not doing the things that are uniquely rabbinic.
And because the services are mixed, there's, obviously you don't have a situation of a woman refereeing a service that's primarily men. Now remember, the reason why, the synagogue service is rabbinic in nature, and when they created it only for men, for practical reasons and for spiritual reasons, etc., etc. That's another whole discussion. One of tonight, we can have it next week. It's an important discussion, but it's very clear that it was created that way and for good reasons.
I think women didn't start attending services till about the 14th century.
Depends where. There's a very interesting Hungarian female tradition. It says in Tehillim, in the Shir Malos, Samachti, I think 123, Samachti ba'omrim li, Beis Hashem Melech. We have rejoiced when they have said to me, let us go to the house of Hashem.
121 or 122?
I think it's 122 or 123. So the Hungarian women used to say, my grandfather told us, that back in the 6th, 17th century, 18th century, when the Hungarians grew, women only went to Shul after they were married. So, Samachti ba'omrim li, I rejoice when you said to me, li, hareyat mekudeshet li, the language of the marriage, because then, Beis Hashem Neileh, then I can go to synagogue. So I'm saying there were a lot of traditions in this regard. My mother's pointed out, and it's historical, that women historically have gotten together anyways. Men, you have to make them get together. As a matter of fact, 5 years ago, at the big Reform retreat, the HUAC, the Reform Congregational Group, they had a separate minyan for men. They made a special men's minyan because in the Reform movement, women have entirely dominated the religious services to the almost eradication of men in any significant role.
Men became minorities.
But it's very simple. But the way my mother explains it says that women by nature get together. Women never have to be told to make a minyan. Women by nature have gotten together to say Tillim, to say Tchinas, and so on. Women are cooperative in nature, more so than men. Whereas men, you have to make them get together and go to a minyan. There are fundamental biological distinctions. But more than that, if someone, remember, minyan is serious business. When the rabbis of the Great Assembly decreed minyan, they say if there's 10 Jews in your town, every morning and every afternoon and every evening you go to a minyan. If you have 2 parents in the house, who are you going to ask to go to the minyan at 7 in the morning? Even today. Ask, if you have a couple working at the Harvard Law School, I guarantee you, and I know this for a fact, they told me, that the female partner still takes a greater, even if she's more senior, she takes the greater responsibility for children and so on when they're small. It's just the reality. And you can argue today to tomorrow, but certainly that's the way Judaism sees it. And therefore, if someone has to go, remember, Shul isn't optional. If someone has to go to Shul, it's going to be the man. And I challenge anyone to suggest that the fundamental nature has changed since then. And here's the key crucial point, which everyone misses. The only way to fulfill an obligation for someone is to be mandatorily obliged. This is a basic principle in Judaism. If you are a child cannot lead the services from Baruch Hu on, a certain point in the morning services, because if he's not obliged to be part of the minyan, because he's a child, he can't lead. So, therefore, a service cannot be led by someone who's not required to do it. And men were required, women not. That's the bottom line. Everything else in Judaism, there's no distinction. With the exception of certain time-bound mitzvot, which are a total of precisely 7, of which four women keep anyways. The time-bound mitzvot are shofar, which women have adopted anyways. Sukkah, which women have adopted when the weather is good. Lulav, which Ashkenazic women have adopted. And shofar, sukkah, lulav. Then there's so all the Passover mitzvot, even though the time-bound are obligatory, the rabbinic time-bound mitzvot, Purim and Hanukkah, are blinding on women anyways. And then you have tzitzis, tefillin, and the reading of the Shema. Tzitzis and tefillin women have not adopted upon themselves. The reading of the Shema women have accepted as part of their daily prayer. In other words, women have to pray at least once, in Ashkenazi tradition, twice a day. And prayer, in the first place, women are obliged to pray, biblically, because biblical prayer did not have a set time. So that leaves you with shofar, sukkah, lulav, talis, tefillin. Bris milah is only because it's biological. So mitzvot that could be done is shofar, sukkah, lulav, tzitzis, and tefillin, and that's basically it. There are no other time-bound. Think about it. What other time-bound positive commandments are there? Mezuzah is not time-bound. Prayer is not time-bound. Oh, the reading of the Shema was the 6th. So there's exactly 3 mitzvot that nowadays women do not do that men do. The whole synagogue thing is all rabbinic in origin, and let me make the point. It's very important to go to Shul, just like it's very important to keep Hanukkah. But they represent a secondary part of Judaism. Most of Judaism is centered around the home, kosher, Shabbos, mikveh, etc. And those things are at least, if not entirely. And by the way, there are some mitzvot that entirely belong to women, like mikveh. They don't belong to men at all. So, and this is something that I noticed from the moment I was a teenager, that all these debates about the role of women emerge from a very simple place. If you live in what I call a Christianized Judaism, if you live in a liberal Jewish community where the entire expression of Judaism is synagogue, right? people don't, as many do, but they don't, as a matter of course, keep kosher both in the home and outside. They don't keep Shabbat in the standard fashion listed in Jewish law. They don't necessarily, give their children extensive Jewish educations. They don't study Torah regularly. So where is Judaism centered? In the synagogue? If your whole Judaism is the synagogue, it's not fair. But if your whole Judaism is in the home, the women have much more greater point in the home. If you have a distorted Judaism that only lies in the synagogue, I agree completely with the conservative reform movement. If your Judaism is centered in the synagogue, then I absolutely agree that women have less of a role in the synagogue than men. But modern American Judaism has taken a secondary, minor, though important part of Judaism and made it everything and thrown everything out. And this started in Germany. Rabbi Shimon Hirsch in 1870 said that I could save Judaism in Germany if we closed every synagogue, including the Orthodox ones, down for 3 years. Because in those 3 years, people would discover that they have to express their Judaism at the home. He says the biggest, the most damaging thing ever to happen to Judaism was the modern synagogue. Because it made it communal, it made it a cathedral thing, rather than individual. And that's the big story. It is absolutely correct that there's no reason that if a woman has something important to say in the realm of Torah, we shouldn't listen to her, as we do.
So, how about within the Orthodox world, there's the partnership minyan phenomenon?
So the way I look at it, it's sort of like the problem with Diet Coke. In other words, why does drinking diet soda usually not lead to weight loss? Because as long as you indulge your sweet tooth, sooner or later you're going to want the real thing. You end up having a chocolate bar or something like that. In other words, if what you're trying to do is say, look, I want to respect halakha, but I really have this itch that needs to be scratched. I need this egalitarian thing. So ultimately, the problem is that whatever you're going to be able to do within the most liberal interpretation of halakha is not going to be truly egalitarian. So if egalitarian is more important to you than halakha, this is just a stop in the road to completely abandoning halakha. So without going into the question of the merits or not, I don't see the logic of it, because in the end you will have to admit there are certain things men can do and women can't. So why not embrace it, accept it, and if once you embrace it and accept it that there's different religious roles, at least in the synagogue, everything's fine. And by the way, one of the interesting things you'll see is if you look at the last generation of Orthodox feminists, their daughters are both more learned than them and not in the least bit interested in having aliyahs and leading services and so on. It's a phenomenon that has been complained about by the mothers, but it's a reality. I have, my wife and I have good friends that the female of the couple, went from being a reform rabbi to a regular religious woman. She just doesn't miss it for a moment. So my point being that that all these things, I'm not arguing with all of the learned halachic analysis and hair splitting as to why it might be okay or at least not okay. The point is, the moment you say, look, I need to go to the end because Judaism is unfair to women, so if it's unfair, you have to undo it. So that I see this just as a way station. At some point, you're going to have to confront the idea, so why not confront the idea where it's always been confronted, instead of creating new things that never existed, and you're still going to feel that craving, if you don't accept that craving is not rational from a Jewish point of view. That's my response. Because you can get caught up in the halachic arguments, that's not the issue. The issue is what's driving it. Anyways, so
Thank you.
May I ask you a sideways question? You mentioned that Qumran community was men alone?
Yes, they considered they considered marriage impure. They were a big influence on Christianity. The marriage was a bad thing and women were impure and so on. Not something traditional Jews embraced. Besides, it tends to have a bad influence on your continuity.
Well, the Shakers are still going strong.
Because they keep bringing new people in, right?
That's how it works.
Right.
That's how the Essenes tried to do it.
Yeah, but there's not too many Shakers.
Well, the Essenes may have just been 10 days too many.
What?
The Essenes maybe weren't going to work like Shakers. Maybe they thought it was 10 days anyway.
Well, that's the general premise. I mean, that it was, with all the upheaval in the destruction of the temple, the pending destruction of the temple, I think, there was a lot of that. I mean, that's where early Christianity got its argument. Everyone felt Mashiach was going to be coming, so, so they felt maybe they had a candidate. Thank you all for coming. Everyone was here so early tonight, e.g. on time.